In 1973, 120 people gathered at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion. They shared a name that once meant more money than the United States Treasury itself. And in that room, according to family biographer Arthur T. Vanderbilt II, there was not a single millionaire. Not one. So, did it go? Section: The boy borrowed $100, 015 to 230. To understand how a fortune this size could vanish, you first have to understand how impossible it was to build. In 1810, on Staten Island, New York, a 16-year-old boy asked his mother for $100. He wanted to buy a boat, not a grand one, a small pirogue used to ferry passengers and cargo across New York Harbor. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he came from nothing resembling wealth. His father worked the docks. His formal education stopped early. What he had instead was an instinct that would define the next 60 years of his life. Figure out what people need moved, and move it cheaper and faster than anyone else. That $100 loan became a small ferry business. The ferry business became a fleet. By his 30s, Vanderbilt had built enough of a reputation in shipping that people started calling him the Commodore, a nickname he never officially earned in any navy, but one that stuck because it fit. He was ruthless with competitors, famous for slashing fares until rivals went bankrupt, then raising them right back up once the field was clear. It's a pattern you'll see repeated by industrialists for the next 100 years, but Vanderbilt was one of the first to master it at scale. By the 1860s, in his late 60s, an age when most men of his era were winding down, Vanderbilt made the pivot that would define his legacy. He sold off his shipping interests and moved almost entirely into railroads. It seemed backward. Ships were his empire. But Vanderbilt saw something most people didn't yet see clearly. America's future wasn't going to run on water. It was going to run on rail. He was right. And what he built next would make his shipping fortune look small. Section 2. The man worth more than the Treasury 230 to 50. Vanderbilt consolidated competing rail lines into the New York Central Railroad, creating a direct line connecting New York City to Chicago. At the time, the single most important transportation corridor in the country. He didn't own trains. He owned the arteries that moved a nation's food, coal, steel, and people. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he left behind a fortune estimated at somewhere around $100 to $105 million. To put that into context, that actually means something. Some economic historians, calculating his wealth as a share of the entire U.S. economy at the time, have argued it made him possibly the richest private citizen in American history up to that point. Wealthy relative to the country's total output than most billionaires are today. It's a claim that depends heavily on how you measure it, and reasonable historians disagree on the exact comparison. But by any measure, this was not just rich. This was a fortune large enough to make the U.S. government itself take notice. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. Vanderbilt didn't split that fortune evenly among his 13 children. He left roughly 95% of it, the overwhelming majority, to a single son, William Henry Vanderbilt. The rest of the family received comparatively modest sums, and some got almost nothing at all. Vanderbilt believed dividing a fortune was the fastest way to destroy it. Keep it concentrated, keep it controlled, keep it growing. For one more generation, that strategy worked better than anyone could have predicted. William Henry Vanderbilt was cautious where his father had been aggressive, but he was no less effective. In the 8 years between his father's death and his own in 1885, he roughly doubled the family fortune to somewhere near $200 million. At one point, a reporter asked him whether his railroads operated in the public interest. His reply, "The public be damned," was printed across American newspapers and became a symbol of Gilded Age arrogance, even though William Henry later insisted the phrase had been taken out of context. True or misquoted, the damage was done. The Vanderbilt name was now attached not just to staggering wealth, but to the growing public resentment of it. The family had reached the summit of American capitalism in under 2 generations. What came next wasn't a slow, dignified decline. It was a spending spree that would become legendary and eventually fatal. Section 3. The Palaces of the Gilded Age 5080. William Henry Vanderbilt split his fortune among his children, and this is where the story shifts from business history into something closer to a family drama played out in marble and gold leaf. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, William Kissam Vanderbilt, and their siblings didn't just inherit money, they inherited a social problem. In the 1880s, New York's old money aristocracy, families like the Astors, still looked down on the Vanderbilts as railroad money, new and unrefined. So the Vanderbilt grandchildren did the only thing that made sense to Gilded Age minds. They built houses so enormous, so ornate, and so expensive that refusing to acknowledge them became socially impossible. Along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, Vanderbilt family members eventually built more than a dozen mansions, several occupying entire city blocks. In Newport, Rhode Island, the summer playground of America's wealthiest families, Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace designed to look modest by comparison to what came next. His brother William K. Vanderbilt built Marble House, using an estimated $11 million, a jaw-dropping sum for the 1890s, much of it spent on imported marble alone. And then there was George Washington Vanderbilt II, the youngest grandson, who took the family's competitive extravagance to its logical extreme. In the mountains of North Carolina, he built Biltmore Estate, a 250-room chateau still recognized today as the largest privately built house in the United States, sitting on grounds that once spanned over 100,000 acres. Here's the part that should stop you. These houses weren't just expensive to build, they were staggeringly expensive to simply keep running. Staffs of over 100 servants, coal furnaces, constant maintenance on structures built to impress rather than to last economically. These weren't investments. They were monuments, and monuments don't generate income. They assume it. At the peak of the Gilded Age in 1883, Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball so extravagant, reportedly costing over $250,000, an almost unthinkable sum at the time, that it forced New York's oldest aristocratic family, the Astors, to formally acknowledge the Vanderbilts as social equals. It worked. The Vanderbilts had bought their way into American royalty. But you can't buy your way out of what comes next. Because while the family was building the most magnificent private homes in American history, something quieter and far more dangerous was already eating away at the foundation. Section 4. The cracks no one was watching. 800 to 1030. Every collapsing empire has a moment where the warning signs are visible, if you know where to look. For the Vanderbilts, there were at least 3, and none of them looked like a crisis at the time. The first was the sheer number of heirs. Cornelius Vanderbilt had understood something his descendants either forgot or chose to ignore. A fortune's too many ways, across too many generations, stops behaving like an empire and starts behaving like sand running through fingers. By the time the money reached the third and fourth generations, it wasn't one fortune anymore. It was dozens of smaller ones, each funding its own mansion, its own yachts, its own social ambitions, with far less of the discipline that built the original wealth in the first place. The second crack was a shift most of the family barely noticed. Very few Vanderbilt descendants stayed actively involved in running the businesses that generated the money. Cornelius had been obsessed with operations, routes, freight rates, competitors. His great-grandchildren were, for the most part, socialites, art collectors, and yacht racers. Money that isn't actively managed doesn't sit still. It erodes slowly through spending that never scales back down to match a shrinking pool of income-generating assets. The third crack was structural, and it came from Washington. In 1913, the federal government introduced the modern income tax. Later came steadily rising estate taxes. For a family whose wealth strategy had always assumed each generation would simply pass on an intact or growing fortune, this was a fundamental change in the rules of the game. Estates that once transferred nearly whole between generations were now taxed on the way down, generation after generation, taking a larger bite each time. None of these three forces alone would have destroyed the Vanderbilt fortune. Fragmentation, disengagement, taxation, each was survivable in isolation. Combined and left to compound for decades, they were something else entirely. Section 5. The world changes around 1030-1300. The early 20th century didn't do the Vanderbilts any favors. The railroads that had built the family's fortune were no longer the unstoppable growth engine they'd been in the 1870s. Automobiles and trucks began chipping away at rail's dominance in shorter distance freight. Regulation, competition, and the simple maturing of an industry meant that railroad profits, once explosive, became steady at best. Then came 1929. The Great Depression didn't discriminate. It crushed asset values across the country, and families whose wealth was tied up in real estate, railroad stock, and enormous non-income-producing mansions were hit especially hard. Maintaining a 70-room summer cottage made sense when money seemed infinite. It made a lot less sense when the value of the assets backing that lifestyle had been cut dramatically, and when finding buyers for anything, let alone a 250-room chateau, had become nearly impossible. By the mid-20th century, the math had simply stopped working. One by one, the great Vanderbilt mansions of Fifth Avenue, homes that had once forced New York's old aristocracy to bend the knee, started coming down, not sold to another wealthy family to preserve, demolished, torn apart for the value of the land beneath them, because land in Manhattan was worth more empty than a Gilded Age palace was worth standing. Think about that for a moment. Structures that had taken years to build, filled with imported European marble and custom craftsmanship that no amount of money could easily replicate today, were leveled because keeping them was no longer financially rational for anyone, including the family whose name was carved into the stone. The houses that had announced the Vanderbilts' arrival at the top of American society, one by one, disappearing, and so, quietly, was the fortune that built them. Section 6. The Room with No Millionaires, 1300-1530. This brings us back to that reunion in 1973. Less than 100 years after William Henry Vanderbilt died holding what may have been the largest private fortune in American history, over 100 of his descendants gathered, and by Arthur T. Vanderbilt II's account, Not one of them qualified as a millionaire. It's worth sitting with how fast that actually is. Compare it to the old proverb often applied to family fortunes: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The idea that the generation which builds wealth is followed by one that maintains it, and then one that loses it. The Vanderbilts didn't even need 3 full generations for the money to functionally disappear from most branches of the family. Cornelius built it. William Henry doubled it. And by the time you reach the great-grandchildren and their children, spread across dozens of branches, diluted by decades of estate taxes, and drained by homes that cost fortunes simply to maintain, there wasn't much left to divide at all. It wasn't a single event. No stock market crash wiped them out in an afternoon. No scandal brought the empire down overnight in the way a company collapses. That's actually what makes this story more unsettling, not less. There was no single villain, no one catastrophic decision you can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. It was slower and in some ways more inevitable. Dozens of smaller decisions, repeated across generations, none of them individually reckless, that added up to the near-total dissolution of one of the largest fortunes ever assembled in the United States. By the time the last of the great Fifth Avenue Vanderbilt mansions was demolished in 1947, the family that once symbolized American wealth itself had, in the public eye, largely faded from the list of the ultra-rich. But largely isn't the same as entirely, because one piece of the empire survived, and how it survived tells you almost everything about what the family got wrong everywhere else. Section 7. What survived and why 1530 to 1800. Biltmore Estate, that 250-room Chateau George Washington Vanderbilt II, built in North Carolina, is still standing today, still owned by his descendants, still, in a real sense, Vanderbilt property. How did the one structure most people would have expected to become a costly, unsellable burden, larger and more expensive to maintain than almost anything else the family built, become the exception that survived? Because at some point, the family stopped treating it as a monument and started treating it as a business. Rather than trying to sustain Biltmore purely as a private residence indefinitely, later generations opened it to the public as a tourist attraction, turning an overwhelming expense into a revenue-generating asset. Today, Biltmore draws well over 1 million visitors a year. It's not a relic being slowly demolished for its real estate value. It's an operating enterprise. That's the single clearest lesson buried inside this entire story. The parts of the Vanderbilt legacy that were run like businesses, actively managed, adapted to changing economic reality, endured. The parts that were treated as static symbols of status, never re-evaluated, never adapted, were the parts that collapsed. The Vanderbilt name itself didn't disappear either. It just changed shape. Gloria Vanderbilt, a great-great-granddaughter of Cornelius, became a successful designer and businesswoman in her own right in the 20th century, building the Gloria Vanderbilt fashion label into a recognizable name in American retail. Her son, journalist Anderson Cooper, has spoken and written extensively about his family's rise and fall, co-authoring a book on the Vanderbilt story in 2021. The empire of railroads and marble palaces was gone, but the name adapted, generation after generation, into new industries entirely. Which raises the real question underneath this whole story: was this actually a failure, or just what happens to almost every fortune this size, eventually? Section. This happens more often. 18 to 20. The Vanderbilts weren't uniquely careless. This pattern, explosive wealth creation followed by generational dissipation, shows up again and again across history, in families and even entire empires. Compare it to the Astors, the Vanderbilts' old rivals in Gilded Age New York, whose real estate fortune also fragmented and diminished across generations, though on a somewhat slower timeline. Or look further back to the Medici banking dynasty in Renaissance Florence, whose financial empire, built over generations, eventually lost its economic power even as the family name lived on through popes and monarchs. Wealth, it turns out, is far easier to create through a single obsessive, focused vision than it is to preserve through dozens of descendants with dozens of different priorities. There's a reason researchers and wealth advisors still cite that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves pattern as something close to a rule rather than an exception. Studies on multi-generational wealth transfer have repeatedly found that a significant majority of family fortunes are substantially diminished by the third generation. The Vanderbilts didn't fall victim to some unique curse. They fell victim to a pattern so common across history that you could almost call it the default outcome, one that only a small number of families, through unusual discipline or luck, manage to avoid. Understanding that changes how you should see this story. It's not really about one family's mistakes. It's about what wealth does to human incentives, generation after generation, when nobody actively fights against the current. Section 9, The Lesson and the Callback, 2020-2020. So what actually happened to the family that owned America? They didn't lose it to a crash, a scandal, or a single bad decision. They lost it the way water leaves an open container left in the sun, not all at once, but steadily, invisibly, until one day the container that once held so much is simply empty, fragmented across too many heirs, poured into palaces that consumed money instead of generating it, left unmanaged by generations more interested in status than stewardship, taxed, decade after decade, by a government whose rules had changed since the fortune was first built. And that room in 1973, over 100 descendants of the wealthiest family in 19th century America, without a single millionaire among them, wasn't some strange historical accident. It was the most predictable outcome in the world, once you understand how it happened. The Commodore built an empire out of nothing, 100 borrowed dollars and a small boat. His descendants inherited a fortune so large it seemed like it could never run out. It ran out anyway, not overnight in the way lightning strikes, but fast enough, within roughly 100 years, that it might as well have been. Outro, teaser for next episode 22:0 to 22:30. But the Vanderbilts weren't the only family who believed their empire was too big to disappear. Across town, in those same Gilded Age drawing rooms, one family had already spent decades looking down on the Vanderbilts as new money, a family whose fortune came not from railroads, but from land itself, and whose name was, for a time, even more powerful than the one you just heard. Their story doesn't end the same way. Next time, the family that quietly owned more of Manhattan than anyone else alive, and the very different reason their empire came apart.